Hello everyone, my name is Preston Dennett and welcome to a new episode of UFOs and the Paranormal. Thank you so much for joining me, I truly appreciate it. I've got a fantastic episode for you today, certainly hope so. I'm going to be talking about my favorite aspect of ufology, which is of course humanoid encounters. There are so many of them. Each and every one I think dives to the very heart of the UFO phenomena and really holds a lot of the answers as to what's going on here. The title of today's episode is Not of This World, 8 Truly Weird Extraterrestrial Encounters. I've got cases from all over the world, including Australia, Brazil, Canada, England, Spain, New Mexico, Pennsylvania, and Virginia. These cases are truly unusual. I love finding these lesser known cases that haven't gotten a lot of publicity, ones that are really unusual in some way or have something to offer to our understanding of extraterrestrial contact on this planet. So let's get going. First case I want to talk about today is a very early case, and gosh, is this one unusual. I call this one The Aliens and the White Wolf. This one occurred in January of 1939 in Lake Abitibi in Canada, and this is a kind of encounter that is absolutely unique in the literature. This very early encounter was investigated by French-Canadian researcher Jean Ferguson and later by researcher Donald Sear, who also interviewed both witnesses' families and confirmed the details of the case. This case involves two witnesses, a gentleman by the name of Damas Landry and his associate known only by his first name and last initial, Hormidas L. Both men were lumberjacks. It was a very cold day, somewhere around January 8th, 9th, or 10th in 1939, or perhaps 1940. Now, despite it being a sunny day, the temperature was very cold, about negative 60 degrees Fahrenheit. Damas and Hormidas had been working near Lake Abitibi, located on the border of Quebec and Ontario in Canada. This is a fairly large lake, about 359 square miles. It's shallow and surrounded by thick forests. It was sometime in the afternoon that the two men decided to take a rest and sit down on some of the fir tree branches that they had cut. Without warning, a large white wolf emerged from the tree line and sat down about 100 feet away from the two men. This, of course, caught their attention. Then, coming out from the same place where the wolf had emerged, they were even more surprised to see about 6 2.5-foot tall figures come walking out of the trees. Now, these little figures were not normal humans. They looked very unusual. They had yellowish skin, flat faces with small slanted eyes, and small facial features. Their heads were flat and they had almost no chin, and their ears were described as triangular shaped. These beings wore dark green puffy suits and apparently no gloves, as the witnesses said that their fingers had no joints. All the little men were perfectly identical in appearance. Now both Damas and Hormidas noticed something else very odd. Despite the fact that it was 60 degrees below zero, there was no visible condensation coming from their mouths. Also weird, these little men walked across the deep snow without snowshoes and without sinking into the snow. Now all this was strange enough, but what happened next was something the witnesses could hardly believe. One of the little men left the others and began to walk towards the wolf. The wolf immediately bristled with aggression, but the little man still continued to approach it, and upon getting close to it, the little man raised his hand and spoke, apparently to the wolf. Neither Damas nor Hormidas could understand the language, but said it sounded to them sort of like Algonquin. Immediately, the wolf lunged and tore this poor little man to pieces. This little being was actually torn limb from limb and bled brown blood into the snow and apparently lay down and died. Now, seeing this, Damas immediately jumped up and threw a branch and shouted at the wolf, and the wolf quickly ran away. Now, the remaining humanoids who had stood off in the background walked up and examined the remains of their fallen comrade. They showed no signs of distress. After about 5 minutes, One of them produced a bag and proceeded to collect all the pieces of the deceased being's body and place them in the bag. Then all of the beings walked back into the forest at high speed. Now Damas and Hormidas attempted to follow the little men, but the little men quickly outpaced them. However, Damas and Hormidas were able to follow their tracks into the forest, and as they did, they heard a loud banging sound ahead of them. Rushing ahead, they found a circular depression in the snow, kind of a hollowed-out basin with all the snow ejected outwards, as if an object had landed there and took off, pushing the snow out in all directions. Afterwards, they did find a small piece of the green fabric from the suit of the deceased alien, which they described as being kind of like green gelatinous rubber. They tried to cut it with their axe without effect, but what happened to this remnant is unknown. What an amazing case that is, and so unusual. I've never heard of those humanoids before. I've never heard of an ET being attacked by a wolf, though I have to say I do know of another case where a dog ripped an ET apart to shreds, very much in the same way this one did. So, an amazing case, and that's also very well verified. There are 2 witnesses, there's physical evidence. It was investigated by 2 researchers who not only talked to the witnesses, but absolutely corroborated it by talking to the witnesses' families. So yeah, it appears to be an absolutely legit, but what an unusual case. So now let's move to the next one, which did get quite a bit of publicity at the time, but it's really not that well known, and it's got some fascinating aspects to it, which I think make it really important. I call this one, We Come on a Peaceful Mission. This one occurred on October 10, 1957 in Quebec, Coco. This is in Brazil. This is an absolutely lovely case, which provides an interesting insight, I think, as to why the ETs are here, as the title implies. This very dramatic case was published in Brazilian newspapers and eventually found its way into numerous UFO publications, including the MUFON Journal, the Brazilian journal SBEDV Bulletin, the Flying Saucer Review, and more. Although very well verified, the case is not that well known. The 2 witnesses include Miguel Espanol Navarrete Fernandez. He was a 35-year-old Spanish naval officer and mineralogist, and his driver Guido. According to one source, they were returning from a fishing trip and had stopped off at a farm and loaded merchandise onto their truck, which they were planning to transport to the town of Ceres for Miguel's employer, a coffee company by the name of Exportação e Importação Planalta Ltd. They left the farm around 6 p.m. For 2 hours they drove without incident, but at around 8 p.m., when they were about 3 miles outside of the small town of Quebra Coco in Ceres, Goiás, Brazil, Guido called Miguel's attention to a bright gleam of light over the hill ahead of them. It was a purple light. Miguel told Guido that it was probably just another truck heading towards them. But as they crested over the top of the hill, both men saw that this brilliant violet-colored light ahead of them on the highway was so bright that it blinded them and illuminated the surrounding countryside. And they could see that it was a craft of some kind. And it was huge. They estimate that it was about 450 to 500 feet wide, about 130 feet high, and as they drove closer, they could see that, yes, this was a flying saucer that was suspended directly over the highway. They drove beneath the craft without any strange effects, but before they could get away, this massive craft suddenly darted to a point ahead of them and then began to zoom towards them. Naturally, this terrified Guido, who was driving, and he shouted out, "My God, that ball is going to hit the truck." At this point, the truck's electrical system cut out, and Guido lost control of the vehicle and swerved off the road. The 2 men were so frightened that they weren't sure if they should run away or stay in the truck and wait to see what happened. But with nowhere to go, they just stayed in the truck. Immediately, the craft came to a stop and descended to a height of about 20 feet above the road and 140 feet away. The blinding light went out, and they could now see the oval disc shape, which they said looked like 2 shallow bowls placed edge to edge, with a central band between them about 50 to 60 feet thick. The craft was mostly featureless except for a very tall, thin aerial, which they estimate was about 130 feet long, and at the very tip of this aerial there was a bright red light. Now, immediately after seeing this craft, a large arched opening appeared on the lower section. It opened from top to bottom, and a soft red light shone out through the opening. Moments later, two beings appeared in this arched doorway. Immediately, two more joined the first two, and then another two arrived, followed by one more for a total of 7 beings. Each of these beings were human-looking, with long hair, but were very short and slim, the size of children. They all wore luminescent, shiny suits with a glowing red section on their chests, which was bright enough to make it difficult for the men to discern their facial features. Guido tried frantically and repeatedly to get the truck going, but the engine was totally dead. The beings then just stood in the doorway and stared at the men for about 3 to 5 minutes. Miguel said that as the men stared at him and Guido, he felt as though he was in a trance and had a strange feeling that the beings were talking to him. As he says, "When those small men were looking at me, I went into a trance-like state and had the strange feeling that they were saying, quote, 'We come on a peaceful mission.'" Then, without warning, the beings moved away from the opening and back into the craft, the doorway closed, the ship climbed to a height of about 1,600 feet, and suddenly this massive mothership released a smaller, disc-shaped craft. The small craft flew off to the north, and this large, massive craft went south. Both disappeared off into the distance, and once they were out of view, the truck started normally. The two men now drove as fast as they dared to the town of Ceres and reported the incident to the police, including to Judge Gabriel Barbosa de Andrade, who was so impressed by the men's testimonies that he actually wrote a letter detailing the incident to the head justice for the state of Goiás, a man by the name of Antenor Gomez. Now later, researcher Olivo T. Fontes interviewed both men, and as he interviewed them, he said that they were both still very emotional about the encounter. Interestingly, 5 days after this encounter, the world-famous Antonio Villas-Boas case would take place in Brazil and become the first UFO abduction case to receive worldwide publicity. What a crazy case that one is. I have to think that this is intentional. Perhaps it was opportunistic in that the ETs just saw this car driving along on a lonely highway at night. Quite a few cases have that pattern. But it certainly looks like it was intentional in that they basically were hovering right over the road in a way that you could not help but miss this craft, seeing this craft. What's so amazing to me is that the witness felt like he had telepathic contact with the ETs, who basically said that we're here on a peaceful mission. So to me it looks like they're basically announcing their presence to these two gentlemen. Or I think it's possible that perhaps this encounter was more extensive than the witnesses remember. Also really interesting to me is that this was just days before the very famous Antonio Villas-Boas encounter, which would electrify the entire world and really be the first case of someone being taken on board to get any significant publicity. So that alone makes this case pretty interesting. All right, now let's move to another really fascinating case from Australia. I call this one The Aliens and the Gas Storage Tank. This one occurred throughout September and October of 1973. There's actually quite a few incidents, mostly sightings, but also, of course, a humanoid encounter, or I wouldn't have included it in this compilation. This one occurred in Melbourne, Australia. And again, this has some important insights, because we often see UFOs showing an interest in our technology. And that appears to be what's going on here. This intriguing and complicated multiple witness case was originally investigated by George Alahouzos and appeared in the volume 25 number 1 issue of Flying Saucer Journal. It began on the night of September 28, 1973, when a witness sighted a glowing star-like object hovering over a large gas storage tank located on Macaulay Road in Melbourne, Australia. It It was the very next night, September 29 at 6:30 p.m., that 14-year-old Frank Alessio stepped out onto the front porch of his home on Queensberry Street. This is just a stone's throw south of the above sighting, and he saw a large disc-shaped craft hovering, he estimates, about 100 feet above the factories near his home. He described this object as dull metallic gray, glowing red on the bottom section, and he said the circumference of the craft had a row of small white lights. Now, using a pair of binoculars, he could see that there were smaller red lights situated around the white lights. Frank shouted for his brother to come see, and, as if in response, the craft immediately emitted a high-pitched whining buzz and slowly, quote, faded out and then disappeared. By the time Frank's brother arrived, the craft was gone. The very next night, now September 30, again at 6:30 p.m., another witness, Wayne Crompton, age 14, stepped out onto the balcony of his home located at 94 Canning Street. This is directly adjacent to the two above sightings, and he described seeing a craft, dull, gray, metallic, hovering less than 100 feet above this same gas storage tank on Macaulay Road. He described it almost exactly as Frank Alessio had. Dull gray metallic disc emitting a red glow from the bottom, but the only difference was Frank had only seen one row of white lights, whereas Wayne said that there were three. But like Frank, Wayne said that the object made a loud, buzzing whine and faded away. Now at this point, none of the witnesses knew about each other. Researcher George Alahouzos spoke with all three witnesses, and he decided to alert another resident who just happened to live on the floor above Wayne Crompton. This witness is Jim Cherasiu, age 13, and he told him that there had been sightings 3 days in a row in this area and asked him to keep an eye on the gas tank in particular and see if any UFOs showed up. And this tactic worked, because the very next night, October 1st, again at 6:30 p.m., Jim says that he saw a large cigar-shaped object with 3 white lights on the front end moving towards the tank at about 500 feet altitude. It quickly descended to a much lower elevation and proceeded to start maneuvering around the tank. Jim said that the object looked kind of like a 20-cent piece. He said it positioned itself at the edge of the tank, stopped, tilted, hovered for a few seconds, and then shot off at great speed upwards to the north. Now later, the researcher George Alahouzos found yet another witness, a man by the name of Greg Stillman, who said that around 6:30 one evening around this same time, he didn't know the exact date, he also saw a metallic disc encircled with a row of lights flying over Canning Street. That's right in this area. So by this time, the researcher George had enlisted the assistance of a local resident by the name of Kelvin Shaw, who was helping him in his investigations. For the last 4 days, this UFO had arrived at precisely 6:30 p.m., so it seemed predictable that the UFO would show up again on October 2nd. But unfortunately, it did not. However, the very next night, October 3rd, brought a whole new level of contact. Kelvin Shaw says that he was asleep in the bedroom of his home, again in this same area where all these sightings had taken place that week. He shared his room with his older brother, and at some point in the middle of the night on October 3rd, he woke up to sense a presence in his room. Sitting up in bed, he saw 2 tall figures standing against the wall on the far side of his bedroom. Both figures, he said, appeared to be floating about 1 foot above the floor and were swaying slightly from side to side. And although the room was very dark, there was enough light to see that the 2 figures had large bald heads, narrow thin eyes, small flat noses, slit-like mouths, and ears pressed to the side of their head. It was too dark to see much of their clothes or bodies, but Kelvin watched the strange figures with no fear, just curiosity, for just a few moments when one of the figures opened its mouth, and at that moment he heard a high-pitched whining sound fill the room, and the 2 figures slowly faded away. Now that seemed to be the end of the visitations, but of course it wasn't. Investigator George Alahuzos was really surprised to hear that months later, on January 20th, 1974, John Cherisiu, the younger brother of witness Jim, said that now he saw a gray metallic disc, apparently the same one, maneuvering around this same gas tank on Macaulay Street. It returned again on January 21st and on January 24th. The next evening, January 25th, it arrived again and was seen by much of the Cherisiu family, including Jim's brothers John and Mario and his sister Stella. They all confirmed that the object circled the tank at least 5 times, then proceeded to perform a series of turns and dives, and at one point approached very close to their home at 94 Canning Street. After it went away, the family was very impressed, so they equipped themselves with a camera just in case it returned again, but it seemed the craft was gone. It wasn't. 2 months later, on March 18, Frank Alessio's father, Joe Alessio, became a witness. He stepped out into his backyard on Queensberry Street, and he saw the object, which he said glowed with bright red light, bathing the area in illumination. He also said he heard it emitting a strange noise before it finally moved off. Finally, on June 1st, 1974, researcher George Alahuzos himself saw the UFO in the area. As George says, it passed by at a very low and dangerous altitude, possibly less than twice the height of the 20-story flats. The craft resembled a thick cigar. Now there were further sightings of this UFO in September, and shortly after all the sightings, in late September 1974, a factory in this area exploded. There was no apparent connection to the prior sightings, but George himself did witness the explosion and says that the fire went out mysteriously very quickly, and he believes that the UFOs may have been observing this very old gas tank. As George says, it is clear that some sort of observational work was underway above the industrial area. Due to the lack of people walking in the streets in the late hours, they, the ETs, had an excellent chance to observe without being observed. Of particular interest was the Macaulay Road gas tank and the Canning Street 20-story block of flats. As for why, I cannot answer. Now, George does say that while many of the witnesses were teenagers, not all were, and he writes, they were truthful in every respect and aided me to the best of their abilities. Interestingly, this gas tank was built way back in 1889, so it was quite old and had apparently reached the end of its useful life because it was demolished in 1978, just a few years after all these sightings. What's amazing to me about that case is the number of sightings in a very sharply defined area, right over this gas tank. So it being really old, I wonder if perhaps this tank was at the end of its useful life and it was posing a danger to the people in Melbourne. Possibly, we don't have direct evidence of that, but it's interesting to me that it was torn down just a few years later after this series of sightings, and there was that nearby explosion. So perhaps the ETs were basically just looking at this gas tank thinking, this is a problem, and trying to call attention to it. I say that because there are similar cases to that. I'm reminded of the Indian Point nuclear power station in upstate New York, as investigated by Philip Imbrogno, where a UFO hovered over one of the nuclear towers there, and they later found out that there was a crack in the actual casing there. So maybe that's what's going on in this case. But a truly interesting humanoid encounter as well, involving ETs that don't seem to be quite your typical grays. Maybe they are. Maybe we're just labeling grays as grays when actually there's a very wide difference in what I would call ethnicity or ancestry, because the number of different types of ETs is off the charts. It's very hard to categorize them. All right, now let's move to another case. A few of you have asked me repeatedly, are there any cases involving non-humanoids, non-bipedal beings? And while I occasionally run across them, I find most of them not very credible and I have questions about them. But here's a case that I did find quite credible. So I call this one Encounter with a Non-Humanoid. This one occurred on August 22nd, 1977 on the island of Majorca in Spain. And this is a truly incredible encounter, and actually a series of encounters, which to me encouraged me to include it because it wasn't just a one-off. This next very unusual case comes from longtime researcher Ignacio Darnaud Rojas Marcos and was published in the August 1980 issue of the APRO Bulletin under the title, "The Spanish Count Who Ran Over a Living Thing." The witness is anonymous, but as the title of the article states, he's a Spanish count, a 47-year-old aristocrat of nobility, married with children, and he has a master's degree in the sciences and was employed as the department manager for a large factory. As Ignacio Darnaud writes, he is a very normal individual, a realist, and a witness of exceptional reliability. It was around 10:30 a.m. on August 22nd, 1977, that the Count was driving his Renault vehicle along the MA-10 highway just east of the town of Escorca on the island of Majorca, Spain. He just passed through a large stone gate and drove about a half mile. Coming around a corner at just over 40 miles per hour, he came upon a short straightaway on this mountain road and saw something standing in the middle of the road that he could not identify. The thing, as he called it, was about 14 inches tall and 6 inches wide, quite small. He said it looked something like a, quote, very stylized bowling pin. It was milky white in color with soft edges, reminding him of a squid or a jellyfish. And although he only saw it for a few seconds, the Count felt intensely certain that this thing was alive, a living being. He is 100% certain that it was not a road marker of any kind. And in fact, he immediately felt a wave of guilt as he had no sooner seen it when he was about to run right over it. And the guilt of realizing that he was about to kill a living being struck him very profoundly. He said the road was too narrow and dangerous for him to swerve, so he did his best to center his vehicle so that his tires would not hit the being. As he ran over it, he did not hear anything or feel any sensation. But passing over it, he glanced in his rear-view mirror. Although he had not felt or heard anything, the little figure was now lying on its side. He continued driving, but quickly turned around at the first possible spot and returned to the location. He exited his vehicle, and at the exact spot where he had seen this thing and ran over it, there was now a small wet stain in the road. He carefully searched the surrounding area, but found nothing else. All signs of the creature or this thing were gone. Now, feeling a powerful feeling of remorse, he continued his drive. Following the incident, he felt a weird buzzing sensation in his ears, and he actually went to the doctor for it, who had diagnosed it as hypertension. This buzzing lasted for about 5 days. The Count believes that this thing, whatever it was some kind of extraterrestrial being, and as he told his father-in-law, quote, "You have to see the bad impression that the extraterrestrial must have taken with him for being so wickedly run over." The whole event affected him very profoundly, so profoundly that he returned to the exact location at least 4 times, bringing his children and his father-in-law with him and conducting an even more exhaustive search, but still found nothing. Another after effect was that following this incident, the Count now carried a camera in his car in case he should see something else, if not for the fact that the witness has a very interesting supernatural history. He is a successful dowser and once predicted the death of a relative. And another very unusual event occurred when he was 11 years old. He and his 2 siblings were approaching an abandoned and destroyed Arabian castle when both clearly saw an Arabian man, complete with a turban, looking out of one of the windows of the castle and then promptly vanishing. Most strange, however, was an event that occurred when he was 6 years old. He was in a country house with his mother, aunt, and other children. A bad storm was in the area when suddenly a very bright ball of fire with blue edges, about the size of a large orange, slipped inside through a partially opened window. This little ball of light crossed the living room and went to a large mirror on the wall, and then moving with obvious intelligence and precision, it went from each corner of the mirror to the other, stopping briefly at each corner, and then rapidly zipped out of the house through another window, leaving behind a strong odor of sulfur in the air. Now the Count only agreed to share his experiences on the condition of complete anonymity. You really can't blame witnesses for insisting upon anonymity, particularly if they're people who hold an important position in society or going forward would pose a danger to their reputation or to their actual career. So I understand that. But I certainly wish people would come forward, because the skepticism and gaslighting and ridicule surrounding this subject has to end. And the only way to end it is for everyone to be truthful, open, and transparent. We're not seeing that with our government. Despite recent steps towards disclosure, the cover-up is still firmly in place, so we still have a lot of work to do. But again, each and every case, each and every person who comes forward adds to our knowledge of what's going on here. All right, let's move to this next case, which I found really compelling. I call this one Something Not of This World. This one occurred one evening in the fall of 1979 in Clearville, Pennsylvania. It is a single witness case, but again, it has some really unusual elements to it, some high strangeness, and it's just a really eerie and unusual case. This case comes from researcher Nathaniel Brislin and appeared in his well-received book Crawlers, a Conclusive Casebook. The report is second-hand from the wife of the witness, who she calls Tim. That is, of course, a pseudonym. The encounter took place one autumn evening in 1979 at the Our Lady of Seven Dolores Catholic Church in rural Clearville, Pennsylvania. On the evening in question, Tim, then a young child, went with his parents to the church for a church function. All the parents were inside the church hall while the kids played outside. Night arrived and the kids were still playing, but after playing for a while, all the kids decided to go back into the church to get a drink. All except Tim, however, who stayed outside. Now the church has its own small graveyard located directly adjacent to the church, and among the graves there are several tall, full-grown spruce trees. Suddenly, Tim heard some loud crashing noises coming from one of these nearby trees, and as the wife of Tim says, he looked up in the tree and saw a set of eyeshine. It was almost like when a car pulls in a lot and the headlights shine. They were shining green, and in hindsight, he compares it to when the predator was up in the tree. As he saw it, it jumped out of the tree and hit the ground and paused. It looked at him for a split second. It was a full bright moon, and once it got out of the tree, he could see it better on the ground. It was about 7 feet tall. The body was extremely skinny. Everything on it was skinny except for its head, which resembled the head of E.T. Large eyes that shone green. The strangest part was the backward bent legs. It's something you can't forget or mistake. They were bent back at a severe angle, then sharply came back to the front. It had long feet. In the moment that it made eye contact with Tim, it paralyzed him with fear. When it took off, he'd never seen anything like it. It went about 300 yards in several seconds in a curved pattern. The field is probably a half-mile long. After about 300 yards, he lost sight of it. Now, Tim's wife points out that behind the church there is a big cave system that the boys used to explore. And in fact, there are several well-known deep caves within 20 miles of Clearville. And Tim wonders if perhaps there might be a connection there. He doesn't know. All he knows for sure is that the encounter frightened him badly. As his wife says, he was so scared that he ran inside and told his dad, crying the whole time. His dad just laughed at him and surely thought he was just making it up. Now Tim, of course, insists that the encounter really happened. As his wife says, Tim is a skeptic of anything paranormal or unexplained. He has to have proof to believe in these things. He swears on his life that he saw this creature. It absolutely wasn't some kind of animal. To this day, when we go out to the church cemetery, I glance up at the trees and wonder what exactly he saw that night many years ago. We think it must have been some kind of alien. There is really no other explanation. It was something not of this world. Yes, that is a single witness case, and yes, the witness was a young child, but I personally find children to be excellent witnesses because they don't overlay their experiences with beliefs or interpretations. They're just reporting what they saw, and they have a great capacity for soaking in knowledge and are really essentially great observers. What's amazing to me is how profoundly this witness was affected by his encounter. That's more the rule than the exception. But I can only imagine what it must have been like for this young boy to see what sounds like a gray type ET hiding in this tree. Really amazing. Now let's move to the next case, which I think is probably my favorite in this compilation. It's always hard for me to pick, but some of these do stand out for me, certainly. I call this one E.T.'s Visit Hospital for Handicapped Children. This is a really touching case which took place on two separate dates, actually, July 18 and October 9, 1980 in Passfield, England. There are a number of cases where UFOs are seen hovering over hospitals, but this one is so poignant, so touching, because this is a hospital for children who have real challenges. And I wonder if there's a connection here, but a very well-verified multiple witness case involving what appears to be two different types of humanoids. This case was investigated by English researcher Omar Fowler, and it first appeared in the November-December 1980 issue of Pegasus, the publication for SciGap, or the Surrey Investigation Group on Aerial Phenomena. It later appeared in the Volume 30, Number 6, 1985 issue of the Flying Saucer Review. It took place at the High Herlands Hospital for Mentally Handicapped Children, located in Passfield, Hampshire, in southern England. At the time, about 24 children were being cared for by about 6 nurses in residence. The High Herlands Hospital sits on about 80 acres of rural farm country. Now, the first hint of any strange activity occurred around 8 p.m. on July 18, 1980, when one nurse, known only as Georgina, heard a humming noise coming from outside the building. As Georgina says, "We heard this funny noise, and we all went outside to see what it was. We saw a light, and we watched it for about 10 minutes or a quarter of an hour, and then Hazel remembered that she had a camera in her room and went to fetch it so that she could take a photograph of it. But I came back indoors because I was frightened. It was just like a big round ball of light, and it kept flashing on and off. It seemed to be getting lower and lower. We didn't actually see it land anywhere, it just disappeared." Now, the nurse with the camera ran outside in time to snap 2 photographs, but when the film was developed, the photos showed nothing unusual. Meanwhile, duty nurse Diane Edworthy gives a slightly different description of the object. As she says, "The nurses who saw the light said it was saucer-shaped and came down to within 30 feet of the ground in the vicinity of the orchard. It was in the area for about a half an hour before it disappeared, though we have been unable to trace anyone who says she actually saw it vanish." Now, this sighting appeared to be the end of the encounter. However, just 4 hours later, Nurse Diane Edworthy and another nurse, Helen Monger, had a second, even stranger encounter, this time with a humanoid. As Nurse Diane says, "Helen Monger and I were on duty that same night at a quarter past midnight when we heard someone out at the back of the building. Then Helen saw a figure go by the back door. At 35 minutes past midnight, we decided to telephone the police, and were just doing so when I happened to look up at the French windows. I saw a figure in black, at least 6 feet tall, looking in through the window at us. He was completely in black and had a huge helmet over his head. He seemed to have no neck. We just saw him standing there. We could not see his face, but he shone as though his clothing was all leathery, or was some fabric that glistened. He seemed to be padded out. By the time we had just gasped, he had stepped back into the darkness and was gone." Now, Nurse Helen Monger confirms this. She describes the same details, but added that the figure was, quote, massive in size and appeared to be, quote, glowing. Now, during the time the nurses saw the figure, the dogs kept in the back room on the ground floor of the hospital were going frantic. Just a few minutes later, the phone rang. Nurse Diane answered it. It turned out to be from the nurses in the other quarters at the other end of the orchard, about a half-mile away. And they said they heard strange noises outside and, looking out, saw a prowler of some kind. Diane was amazed, as this figure had somehow apparently traversed the half-mile distance in no more than 3 minutes, unless of course there was more than one of them. 15 minutes later, the police arrived with police dogs. They inspected the soft ground where this figure had been seen looking in the windows, but they found no footprints, nor did the dogs detect anything. Unable to find any evidence, the police concluded that the nurses had imagined the entire incident. Now, interestingly, and perhaps significantly, only 3 weeks earlier, one of the nurses said that she saw another strange figure looking in the window, and she got a good look at it. That figure, she said, was a man with shoulder-length blonde hair. Now, they had assumed it was simply a peeping Tom, but in light of the new incident, perhaps both encounters were related. And events weren't over yet, because it was less than 3 months later, on October 9, 1980, the High Herlands Hospital was visited by UFOs again. This time there were only 2 witnesses, duty nurse Diane Edworthy and another nurse by the name of Kathy. As Nurse Diane says, at about midnight, Kathy, the girl who was on duty with me, said she could hear a humming noise, which I didn't hear. Though I could not hear it, she was really going mad about this noise that she said she had in her head. I thought she was being fanciful and did not take any notice, and I went to see the children upstairs. When I looked out the window, I saw lights in the sky. They were really bright, and that is what made me look. It was such a clear night, and the lights could be easily seen. I then went downstairs to get Kathy to come up and have a look, because the light was moving so slowly. This was at the back of the house. We then went into the front of the house because as we watched it, the light had disappeared round to the front. Now at the front they saw that the light had taken on the appearance of an abnormally bright star, which was now changing colors. It changed from white to blue to red to green to orange, and then back to white. This took place over a period of about 45 minutes, during which time the 2 witnesses were taking breaks from watching it as they had to check on their patients. But still, this object remained very low and apparently quite close to them. As Diane says, we opened the main window so that we could actually look at it, as there was a lot of condensation on the window. It was at a few hundred yards, level with us, but we were looking from the hospital, which is perched up very high on a hill. It was like a white light on top. I couldn't see the shape of the object that was moving, but underneath it were flashing lights, reds and greens. Now at this point, in addition to this unusual light, a solid craft emerged from the light and descended close to the ground, and this is what Diane is describing. As Diane says, that light was still changing colors when we saw this craft hovering right over the edge of the orchards, and it remained there for about 20 minutes. It just stayed there. It looked as if it was spinning because all the lights were twinkling. They were all different colored lights, all at once. There was no sound whatsoever. It was so quiet. There are horses out in the paddock at the side, and there wasn't a sound. The dogs didn't bark. Nothing. Now, shortly later, the dogs did start howling and, quote, went mad. And also the cats started acting up, with their hair bristling. The nurses tried to let the animals out, but the animals refused to budge. But the most amazing and unusual part of the encounter was about to happen. As Diane says, we were looking after a little boy that was very ill. He's mentally handicapped, and he has a tumor on the brain. We both had the opportunity to watch that light because we had to sit with the little boy who was so ill. Now he was going quite frantic. He started going really frantic at about 12:30, and he never settled down until 3:30. And at 3:30, the light disappeared, and then he went quiet, just like that. What an amazing case that is. Multiple witnesses, animal reactions. I was particularly struck by the report of the sick child reacting in some way to the presence of the UFO. Makes me wonder if they were communicating with him in some way. I wish there was a follow-up with this patient. Perhaps they cured him. Pure speculation, obviously, but sure would be interesting to know what became of this child, given that he was reacting clearly to the presence of this UFO. But how cool is that these ETs are visiting this hospital for mentally and physically handicapped children? To me, that's really touching. All right, let's move to the next case. Another really unusual case with some details I haven't heard before. I call this one, I Had a Talk with Greys. This one occurred on April 25, 1997. It's actually more like a series of encounters, but this occurred at Angel Fire, a very small town in rural New Mexico. And yeah, it's got this weird connection to Native Americans that I found super fascinating. This case occurred on April 25, 1997 in the small town of Angel Fire, New Mexico. This is a pretty rural town. This case comes from a lady who provided her first-hand eyewitness testimony to MUFON just over 25 years after her experience. And in her report she writes, I never told anyone of this until recently. There are times I still want to justify or prove false what went on. I know it is my truth. I finally feel like sharing it and connecting with others who have had similar experiences. Thank you. Now this witness is anonymous, so I'll just call her Vicky. In March of 1997, Vicky had the opportunity to run a small elementary school as the man who is currently running it, a Native American elder and his wife, a medicine woman, were leaving so that he could pursue lecturing and writing books. So Vicky took this opportunity. She moved from Ohio to the Native Americans' small mountain cabin in this very rural area outside of Angel Fire. It was a wonderful opportunity for her, and she was very excited about it. She made the 3 days long drive and went to the cabin. And as Vicky says, I was greeted by him and his woman. I was to live with them for 3 weeks while they prepared my position taking over the school and make the transition. During those 3 weeks, the elder and the medicine woman decided that they needed to teach me a bit about UFOs and extraterrestrials. I realized the elder was involved with that area of life because I had gone to his lectures and read his book. I learned that Native Americans have this amazing respect for aliens and their ways. He actually worked with certain groups in order to learn from them and they from him and create a community. At night, they would ask me to come outside and sit on the picnic table so they could teach me the difference between planes, jets, satellites, military and alien ships. It was all about the shapes, movement, and lighting. It was very interesting. I was never afraid and always a believer. So the 3 weeks passed quickly and soon Vicky found herself alone in this rural cabin. Or so she thought. As Vicky says, strange things began to happen. I would be standing in the bathroom looking into the mirror with the door open, and out of the corner of my eye, in my peripheral vision, I would see blurry dark figures walking by, or major flashes of light. It became a regular thing, and it was bothering me. It was as if there were others in the cabin with me, but I knew no one was coming in. There were no neighbors anywhere nearby, and Vicky had not invited anyone into the cabin since she had moved in. And as time moved on, the high strangeness began to escalate. As Vicky says, things began getting stranger when sleeping at night. I would get that feeling like people were watching me. Quickly, I would open my eyes and sit up, and there would be 3 grays on 3 sides of my bed. I knew what they were, and that they were the grays. When I put on the lights, they were gone. Just like that, gone. I began to sleep with the light on at all times, blankets tucked up high on my neck, and honestly would try to keep myself awake as long as possible. It became a real scary, horrible situation for me. There was no one to talk to, and no one I could tell. They would think me nuts. So Vicky tried to convince herself that it was not happening, but for the next 2 weeks, it kept happening, and she knew she had to take action. As Vicky said, "Finally, I had a talk with the Greys, giving them permission to stay as long as they did not hurt me. I knew they were curious and wanting to learn things from me. It got very intense, and I became a mess, emotional and desperate. I did not know what to do." So with no other recourse, Vicky finally called the medicine woman and told her what was happening. The woman immediately understood and promised to come over and help. She arrived shortly later and explained that the Greys were not supposed to be coming. She said that her husband, the Native American elder, worked with the Greys regularly, but that he was supposed to have had told the Greys to stop showing up, but failed to do so. So together, she and Vicky went through a process of smudging the cabin and clearing it. The medicine woman explained that it was up to Vicky to take a stand, to lose her fear, quiet her mind, and also to call upon spirits of light to assist and protect her. So the Greys continued to show up, but Vicky stood her ground and slowly the activity slowed down. And as Vicky says, "The last night they were there, I was really struggling, and an angel appeared to me and whispered in my ear, 'It's almost over. You are almost through. It is almost done.'" Before the medicine woman left, she told Vicky that the Greys were actually planning on taking her, and this scared Vicky bad enough that she decided to just completely move to a new residence in Taos, New Mexico. And as she said, in time, it was as if they never came back. That case is so interesting to me. I've noticed a pattern as to who's having contact and why. And we see a lot of people who are doing good work for humanity in some capacity. So we see doctors and nurses, teachers, musicians, social workers, environmentalists, people who are doing good work in some way. And that's true in this case and in a few of the others in this compilation. I found that really fascinating. Also interesting to me is that the Native American featured in this story apparently had a very close relationship with these Greys and was working with them. I've talked to a number of the Native Americans over the years, and they've had these really incredible relationships with ETs. So that's fascinating to me. Also really interesting is that this lady had repeated encounters and was able to communicate with the ETs and essentially end her encounters, which she found frightening, which I can certainly understand. But all around, a lot to unpack with that case. All right, now let's move to the next one. This one is a pretty short case comparatively speaking, but still interesting. I call this one a strange feeling. This one occurred one evening in November 1998 in the small town of Galax, Virginia. It is a single witness case, but there are humanoids, and when there are humanoids, it's almost always fascinating. This last and final case was reported to MUFON headquarters after the witness mailed a letter there explaining his encounter. And a MUFON field investigator interviewed the witness regarding the sighting that he had of a UFO with human-looking occupants inside it. The witness is anonymous, so I'll call him Anthony. On the night of November 20, 1998, after having gone hunting, Anthony's mother brought him to a friend's house in the Old Town district of Galax, Virginia. She was inside the house, but Anthony stayed out on the driveway and was looking at the moon and the sky. The moon was in full phase. The sky was perfectly clear. And as he stood there, Anthony started to get a really strange feeling. As he says, "I had a strange feeling that something was either wrong or unbalanced. I'm intuitive in that way. I felt an urge to look to my right, so I did. I saw nothing at ground level. So I looked up. It was then that I saw the long, tangerine yellow colored object moving slowly and silently across the night sky in my direction. It was flying at low altitude, low enough that I barely raised my head to see it broadside." So he had a pair of binoculars on him and quickly used them to view the object, but was unable to capture them in the view screen. So instead he grabbed his rifle and looked at this object through the rifle scope, and he could see it. And he now saw that the craft was magnified enough to be able to see a window on one side of the craft, and through the window he saw at least 2 human-looking figures. As he says, "Through my scope, I made out a couple of figures inside a well-lit craft. I saw a human-looking pilot with light skin with light tan coloration. His hair was blondish in color and just below the shoulders. The background light was white, like a sterile, clean room. I saw one other human-looking being inside the craft. I saw them for a few seconds. The being walked away from the pilot towards the rear of the craft. I didn't see the second being any more during the encounter." So Anthony studied the craft for normal airplane navigation lights, but saw none. The entire craft glowed with a tangerine yellow, brighter on the bottom and slightly darker on top. He listened very hard to hear if it was making any noise, but he couldn't hear anything. He then lowered his scope to watch the object with his naked eyes, and as he watched, it passed directly in front of the full moon. But weirdly, when the craft reached about halfway across the face of the moon, it vanished from view. It didn't appear to move away, it was just gone. The witness continued to search the sky with both binoculars and his rifle scope, and of course his naked eyes, but he couldn't find anything. Nevertheless, he is convinced that he saw a genuine UFO. As he says, "This was my first ever encounter with a UFO, and I'll always remember it." I think you'll agree that's a pretty interesting case. I like that the witness was able to view this craft close up using the scope in his rifle, so he got a good look at it. We can't say that this person misperceived this humanoid because he saw it and described it very clearly. Initially, I wondered if this might be a human-piloted, reverse-engineered craft, but then he describes this thing moving in front of the moon and just disappearing. I don't know that we have the ability to do that, but certainly we do see that with the ETs. Either way, it's another case adding to the huge catalog of humanoid encounters. It's not just 10 or 100 or 1,000 or 10,000. We're approaching hundreds of thousands, and I'm guessing it's more accurately in the millions, given that, as any UFO researcher will tell you, most people don't report their encounters, particularly if it involves a humanoid or a very close encounter, such as an onboard experience. But again, we're seeing a huge variety of ETs. I love it when these cases have some sort of communication with the witness. That's pretty rare. Much more common, of course, with onboard experiences, which are my absolute favorite. I'll be doing more episodes about that, don't you worry. But yeah, love these humanoid cases. Always fascinating and always something to teach us. So thank you again, guys. I truly appreciate you all watching. It means a lot to me. I think this subject is so important and that we all deserve to know the truth about what's going on. So that's it for today. Once again, it's up to you to keep searching for the truth, keep asking those hard questions, and please keep having fun, because that's why we're here. See you next time. Bye for now.